Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
And hello, everybody, and welcome back. Yes, this is Doug, and I am back in the studio with Mr. Cody. How in the world have you been in 2020, buddy?
I don't even know how to answer that. I
shouldn't have asked.
Even know how to answer that question. Yeah. Other than I can say I am at my house in Mableton.
Yep.
I have been here for the last 7 months.
Well, the bad part is I've pretty much been here in Decula, and I like it. Now, Danae is a 7 on the Enneagram, so she's going crazy.
Well, you and I are very similar people.
Mm-hmm.
We're built in a very similar way in that
we're antisocial.
Yeah, we are, or you could say that, or you could just say we're introverts, which we are. But yeah. The listeners, first of all, let me say to all the listeners, I have missed you.
Yeah.
I mean, we were on a hot streak, and then this pandemic happened. And it just completely threw everything off. And I've literally just been in the cave for the last 7 months. I mean, there's nothing's happening, right? And that's all around the world. But we had to scramble to figure out how to do this. And here we are now, 7 months later. And the listeners need to know we're not together. You're at your house. I'm at my house. And we're recording, but we're also on Zoom.
Yeah.
So I preface all this to say, be very, give us a lot of grace. At any point in the conversation, the internet could just shut down.
Right.
Or I could fade out, or your voice could fade out, or whatever.
Sure.
So if that happens, the listeners just need to know that we're in two completely different places trying to record on like an audio version on Zoom.
Right. And that we can't forget that Paul taught that Satan is the prince of the power of the air, which he was talking about the internet. And so if anything happens to the quality, we also need to know there are forces attempting to stop this message. But we're going to keep going, doggone it.
Well, that's spiritual. They used to call that spiritual warfare where I grew up. So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of warfare, it's a great segue right into this controversial subject, right? We are going to move into this session, which I don't know how many sessions it will be. Cody and I are just taking material as it comes along. We're going to talk about the Trinity. And so the Trinity is the subject, and it's only a subject that has 2,000 years basically worth of information that goes with it. So we're going to take it. We're going to look at its background today. We're going to talk a little bit about the implications of why the Trinity needs to be re-examined through an integral approach. And eventually we will get to one of these sessions where Cody and I will talk a lot more specifically from the narrative itself, because ultimately that is what we use as a foundation in Presence is integral theology, which we take from the biblical narrative, which we call a narrative. Because it unfolds the nature of God and the nature of our relationship with God, and therefore our nature as well. So we're starting on the Trinity today, and a very interesting subject that kind of like the Atonement, Cody. It's real interesting to me that in the last, 15, 20 years, there began to be a real pushback on the Atonement theories. And because we began to evolve in the way that we understand that which the narrative calls God. And it just wasn't making any sense that as we grew in the depth of spiritual consciousness, that we had this God who somehow or another was looked a whole lot like the God back in the tribal warrior era, and we were trying to do things to please that God, and finally he had to take someone who is described as his son. So there's a blood sacrifice, just like you would do back in a temple in the old days. So there's a pushback on its bottom line. So here we have the Trinity. And now, Cody, I think you and I both know that we're experiencing in conversations that people are beginning to have a pushback on the nature of the Trinity.
Okay. First of all, let's go back. Here we go. It's like starting a fire. The atonement, just for those listeners that may be joining in for the first time, because I know you've put a couple of podcasts out. You've taken the audio from some of the video sessions that you've done, but help us remind our audience. You went through a whole series of online live sessions about the atonement. And are those still available for them somewhere?
They're on the presence.tv website. When you go to Integral Theology, you'll see that you have a choice to either select our audio podcasts, which you and I have been doing for quite some time, and which are now accompanied with the show notes thereof. And then you're also going to see that there are videos available. And the videos that cover the atonement, I think there's about a 4-part maybe I did on atonement through Zoom video. And we had some of our presence folks sit in live on that. After the video cut off, we would always have some discussion. So those are available on the Presence website.
Okay. Enough information. Let's jump into this. I think it might be good, Doug, to start perhaps with this question. Why would we be having a conversation about the Trinity? And here's what I mean by that. What does it matter? I mean, this is a 3rd or 4th century doctrine that we'll get into later that's been debated for really the last 2,000 years. But what does a conversation about the Trinity matter to a mom with 4 children? What does a conversation about the Trinity matter to someone who's trying to survive during the pandemic? I mean, what I'm asking is if someone's listening to this and they just turn the podcast on, they're probably like, wait, you guys might be the only people on the planet having a conversation about the Trinity. Now, granted, there are some like Bible nerds, seminary people, theologians, all that kind of stuff who have these conversations all the time. But to like the average layperson, why is it even important to have a conversation about a doctrine that was created in the 3rd or 4th century?
Yeah, well, to me, it goes back to why I did the series on the atonement, Cody. I described at that time to our listeners, and it again is on the website, that there are new movements afoot. And one of the movements that really got my attention some time ago was a movement that very active now called Theology Without Walls. You'll see a lot of material on it. If you go listen to that and watch the atonement videos, you'll get a lot of background on Theology Without Walls. Theology Without Walls as a movement, to me, Cody, is just another indicator of what's happening with spiritual consciousness going up the spiral of bigger and bigger and more inclusive thinking when we talk about the nature of the God that is in the biblical narrative. God becomes less and less particularistic. God becomes less and less divisive. God becomes more universal to all human beings in terms of all human identity. And there's a real pushback as people go, especially even into what folks might call themselves, if you're listening, maybe a progressive Christian, for example. Well, if you're a progressive Christian, that's why I did the Atonement series. You're going to find that earlier interpretations handed down of atonement just aren't working for you anymore. And the same is true for the Trinity. And so why we're talking about this is because all of these doctrines, creeds, and dogma relate to what Theology Without Walls would call walls. And they divide, and they either divide Christianity into thousands of denominations from an internal standpoint, or these doctrines, creeds, and dogmas divide Christianity from the rest of the world. And rather than God having a universal meaning to every mom and dad living in the neighborhood around me and that I encounter on my trek to any place I go, that meaning is more and more difficult for me to convey, because there are doctrines and creeds and that to me represent walls that people just can't get past. So you bring up the thing about, what meaning would it have to a mom today or anybody today who's just getting up and getting ready for their day, right? It's not going to have the kind of meaning that it had in the past, when the blue meme world was all about doctrine and creed and dogma as the way your identity was determined. And people are pushing back against that. And so therefore it's becoming a bigger and bigger wall. And it's time for us to re-examine, using an integral approach to this subject, like we do all subjects. It's time to look through an integral lens and say, is there a better way to talk about God and to talk about Jesus? I think you have some real interesting stories that are even coming out of seminary that you shared with me, whether we get to them right now or later, that really shocked me. And that is, once you start talking about the Trinity and you're trying to figure out God and Jesus and God, and you start evolving a bit in your thinking, then you even begin to have among pastors these questions about, well, now that I sit here and think about it, who is Jesus? And so to me, it's a clarification thing, and it always starts, as we have in everything we've done, it starts with identity. Identity. Who am I? Who is God? Who is Jesus? These are identity questions, and it is the identity crises that currently controls the media and the stories and the narratives that we see around us, the protests, the hostilities that come from walls that people perceive are between each other, that make each other different, rather than the walls coming down so that we can, through unity, see each other as one. So that's a big, high-level picture, I guess.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the tension is oftentimes when you hear anyone talk about something like the concept of a Trinity or a Trinitarian view, we seem to fall into kind of a malaise, like our eyes kind of glaze over because we're like, oh God, here we go. And I get it on some levels, because it can feel so abstract and elusive. It can feel like it's some kind of doctrine that floats so high that there is, it's kind of divorced, I guess, from our life, everyday life and practice. And what does it have to do with where we are right now? I would just say, though, there's a flip side to that. And if there's a danger of kind of theory without practice and that being empty, I think the opposite of that is true. There's also a danger with practice without theory being kind of this situation that we're stepping into. And here's what I mean by that. A lot of our listeners, they're all over the place, right? From integral theory to progressive Christians to full-on atheists and everywhere in between on the spiral. But there is a percentage that we know of, that we heard of, that have been through, you could call it a deconstruction, whatever you want, but essentially they're in this liminal space between first tier and second tier.
Yep. And
what is transpiring, and this is why we're having this conversation, and I'm not here to try to convince you to listen. Either you find it engaging or you don't. However, I will say that one of the things that I find so imperative about having this conversation on the Trinity is that there have been lots of really good theologians and people to help us tear down the walls, right? To deconstruct the faith, to poke holes in the doctrine of the Trinity. The problem is, maybe a problem, maybe it's not a problem to some of you, but but it feels void of something. And what I mean by that is there have to be some sense of reconstruction. And this is the thing we've talked about over and over again. Okay, so we've done away with the Trinity. The question is, so it still doesn't answer the question, which is, what do we do with Jesus?
Yeah.
This is the fundamental question. And this is why it's so important for me, is because we can say all day long, well, and I meet people all the time. It's like, I don't believe Jesus is God. Okay, great. Why? And there's not a large response to that because I haven't thought through it other than it's kind of a gut feeling like, no way he can be. And, or you can say something like, okay, if Jesus is not God, then here's the question. And then this is the question that we got into. So most of your listeners know this, but I'm at Emory right now, taking some courses, and I happen to be in a systematic theology class.
That sounds like fun.
It's just funny to say if you know my life and where I've come from. But I'm sitting in this class, and Doug, I was actually really surprised. I think the professor posed a question like, how many of you in this room believe Jesus is God? And maybe 10% of the room held up their hand, which I guess shouldn't be surprising at like a liberal university, but I was a little bit surprised because I really thought more than that. Yeah, I really thought more than that because a lot of these folks are like, they would still hold the label Christian. But that said, he started one by one going through each classmate, and he said, it's okay, so you don't believe Jesus is God. So then he paused and he said, but answer the question, who is Jesus to you? If he's not, you've told me what you don't believe about God. You've told me what God is not to you. You've told me who you don't believe Jesus is. But who is Jesus to you? And of course, this brings up loads of questions, Doug. Loads of questions, which we'll get into. Give you a couple. If you don't believe Jesus is God, then where do you situate the Christ in the story? And then that brings up larger questions. Why do you still call yourself a Christian? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be a Christian? Mm-hmm. And then we got to talk about idolatry, because if we don't believe Jesus is God, then why are we singing songs about Jesus?
Right. And I love what you said just a little bit earlier. And I usually always put this disclaimer in. But for anybody who's listening and is on the new end of this, or you're really getting into the integral theology, there may be subjects like this where you run right into a wall listening to us because the wall you're feeling is, wait a minute, what are you saying? Jesus is not God. Whoa. So just know, if you're new to listening to the Presence podcast, that we're strictly talking for people that are wanting to move beyond the way the atonement was interpreted, wanting to move beyond the way eschatology's been interpreted, the way the Trinity's been interpreted, not because we're just out to get beyond it so we can say, hey, look, we've got to evolve, progressive. No, we're trying to engage in meaning making. Everybody has, as Paul Tillich says, matters of ultimate concern. And that for us is the concern about the division that's in the world that will inevitably come back to these doctrines. And so to your point, Cody, the questions are loaded. There's so much that goes through my mind. As you just asked those questions, I thought, well, we could sit here for a couple hours and just go through on this. But one of the points I made in the first series, and I want to keep coming back to the approach to a theology without walls. The problem now facing anyone who wants to go beyond the traditional viewpoints, the problem is Christology. That's number one. Christology and its interpretation is now a problem when you want to move toward an understanding of God that is universal to all people on the planet and can have and should have meaning to all people on the planet. That's number one. And the second thing about Christology is that Christology is God's transformative work in both the individual, Jesus of Nazareth, and the collective, the body. You can't talk Christology without talking about the body. And oftentimes these things are separated. People want to talk about Jesus as God, Jesus, but what about the body? Is the body God? Well, no, the body's the church. That's not good. Okay, so you have a head and you have a body. And in some way or another, they have a different nature, is what you're saying. That in some way, the head is separate from the body. Well, my experience biologically understanding is when you separate the head and the body, it causes problems. So there's so much, and that's just a little thing. There's so much to be discussed here, but when going back, Cody, to identity, just setting the stage so you know where we're going. Identity has always been in all of our podcasts related to God, always related to God. All other characters in the narrative, whether it's Adam or Moses or Abraham, David, all the way up through Jesus of Nazareth, all other characters play a role and function. There is a huge difference between identity and role and function. And if you go listen to our previous podcast, we give many examples of this would be identity, this would be role and function. When you make Jesus God, you are making Jesus identity. Now, a Christian would say, that's right. That's right. Jesus is identity. I am a Christian. That's what we're challenging. We're saying, no. We are children of God, and it is God who, through Christ, reconciled, restored, and brought identity to all people. So, Cody, when we're talking Trinity, the first thing is understanding that Jesus of Nazareth had a role and function, and so did the body, and both the function and role of Jesus of Nazareth and the body collective is called Christology. And you can't separate Christology and reduce it down to simply Jesus of Nazareth and saying Jesus is God. The other thing is that the role and function of Jesus is transform. God is formless. So in our Venn diagram, which you'll see in our podcast going all the way through, the movement of the narrative is form to transform to formless. And that's why once we begin to understand the numerous ways that Jesus represents transform, then I can talk to anybody on the planet about transformation, because if whatever problems we've got, we're trying to figure out how to move from those problems to a solution, and that's a transformational process, and that's what Jesus was all about modeling. Jesus didn't come to prove he was God so that we could have a confessional dogma. Jesus came to say, this is the way you live as a human. This is the way you move from a problem to a solution. This is the way you move from bondage to freedom. This is the way you move from death to life. Jesus was purely transformational in his role and function. So just at the outset, this is just to kind of give a flavor, I guess, Cody, of where we're going to be going with this reframing of what has become a test. I mean, Catholic Church, 1,500 years, and then even on up to today, if you don't confess that Jesus is God, you have stepped outside the form of that which they define to be Christian. So it's a big deal.
Yeah. There's a question that I write at the top of all of my sermons, like my talks or whatever that I give, and it's always, what's at stake here? What's at stake? And in large part, that's what we're asking here, is that there's actually a lot at stake here. And this is, and we've just listed a couple, but this is why this conversation is not only necessary, but it's a conversation that is being had right now all over the place, actually. And I think, Doug, and I wonder, maybe you can help us with this. I wonder if the reason how we situate Jesus, the idea of how we situate Jesus, is such a predominant conversation right now, in large part because of the evolution that's taking place. Would you describe that the reason this is even an imperative point, and the reason lots of people are talking about it, is because you believe we're kind of on that leading edge, that leap from first tier to second tier?
There's no doubt in my mind that's exactly what's happening. If you go to the book that was published on Theology Without Walls. It is a compilation of a number of different theologians, even from different religions outside Christianity, from Buddhism and Hinduism, etc. So to your point that you're making here, one of the chapters is by Dr. Jeffrey Long, who has a PhD in Hinduism. He grew up in Roman Catholicism, but he moved into Hinduism because he was really attracted to the way that it helped in his personal transformative living versus dogma and creed oriented as he understood his Catholicism. Well, the biggest part of his chapter, Cody, is how the sticker is Jesus is God. That is the divider between about 20% of this planet and the other 80%. The other 80% of this planet, and we will talk about this as we get into maybe toward the last session. I'd like to give an example or two of how Jesus becomes far more meaningful in a conversation with a Buddhist than a conversation with a Hindu and others. When Jesus is not God, that's not the reason I'm doing this. I'm not saying, hey, how can I figure out a way to have a good conversation with other people in other religions? No.
You're just trying to be relevant.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I'd like to have a friend. And so what has happened, though, is it's the opposite, that once I begin to see Jesus in his transformative role and function as a son and not father, and I begin to see how relationship works, then I can have relational conversations with anyone, including the other 80% of the world. But most people, when you get in this doctrinal argument or any argument of doctrine, Cody, that's where we go denominational. And we retreat to whatever denomination we're in and their position on it. And we completely forget that most of the world is outside of this identity that we're claiming this, particularistic identity. And the big sticker, Buddhism says it, Hindu, they all look at Christianity and go, wow, if Jesus is God, that's a pretty big wall.
And I wonder if that's why we've tried to make Jesus universal.
Yeah, well, then, because now you're telling them, oh, well, you're part of the cosmic Christ. No, I'm a Hindu. Oh, no. You're part of the cosmic Christ. It's like, no, I'm telling you, I'm a Buddhist. And so we will tease this out if it's a little foggy to people right now, because we're just entering in on this first session. We will tease this out as we go along down the road.
Yeah, because I'm sure our listeners probably have already lots of questions, which is a part of our purpose on this particular podcast. But to give you kind of a rundown a little bit, we'll get into it. We'll talk about the history of this evolutionary Trinitarian thought. So really from the first century all the way up, it really starts heating up around the third century, Nicaea. So we'll get into that. So this is a long history. I mean, people have been talking about this. I mean, since the first century, people have literally been in debates. And by the way, you should know, there has been blood shed over this doctrine alone, which is insane to me. But we'll get into why that is. And then we'll move to obviously the biblical narrative. And because I already just listened to you talk. I have loads of questions. What do you do about the Father, Son, and the Spirit? What do you do about Genesis 1? What do you do about I and the Father are one? On and on and on. There's like 18,000 proof texts that we could get into. So all those questions. And then we should probably talk about too, like what do people feel like they're losing when they give up a Trinitarian view, if they surrender that, or if they evolve out of that? And why would one still hold that? There's been a lot of work recently, a lot of recent theologians and scholarship work about perichoresis and the divine dance and stuff like that. We need to talk about perhaps what's in that is attractive to people, that maybe they're by not subscribing to a Trinitarian view, they're losing something there. So we can get into that. I say all that to say,
yeah,
we're just laying out. This is what we want to talk about over the course of the next little bit. So if you have questions, yep, you should. Yeah, makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is kind of kicking it off, gang, and we appreciate you listening as usual. And we will look forward to seeing you next week as we continue on this series. See you then.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.